We live in Colorado, home of the cowboy, the great American cowboy, the libertarian cowboy, the guy who takes the law into his own hands where a man's got to be a man. Well, my next guest says nuh-uh. Ryan McMaken, author of the Commie Cowboys? Commie Cowboys? This got my attention. Now, I think of cowboys through entertainment, and this book is about entertainment. I think of Hollywood cowboys. You know, we were Republicans. We like John Wayne. We like the Duke. All right, that's America right there. You know, a guy strong, silent, does the right thing, not for accolades, just because it's what a man's got to do. Why is he a commie? What's the idea behind this? This is brilliant.
The title really, of course, is supposed to be provocative, but really comes out of the fact that I looked at a lot of the high-budget Westerns, especially from the post-war period, that Cold War period from 45 to 65. And I found that in many, many cases, the bad guys in these movies were usually capitalists, big ranchers, big landowners, and they were opposed to, very often, a government agent, whether it be a cavalryman or a sheriff. And I looked at that conflict in a lot of these Westerns from that period, and a lot of these Westerns end up taking the position that really freedom is made possible by government interference, and that the bad guys on the frontier were these greedy landowners who were trying to oppress the rest of us.
But isn't that the way it was? All right, let's give me a couple examples. I mean, I think of things, you've got True Grit, all right? I love True Grit, not whatever remake they had. No, True Grit with the Duke. That was a great movie. Here's a guy who's salty, swears too much, drinks too much, and he ends up doing the right thing.
True Grit is not one of the biggest violators.
What's the biggest violator?
That I look at. Certainly the films of John Ford are probably the biggest violators.
John Ford is the Western. John Ford is the Western.
That's true.
Another great one.
Which greatly proves my point, because when we look at Ford, if we ignore the fact that he made The Grapes of Wrath and made U.S. propaganda films during the war and all that sort of stuff.
It was a war. It was a war. All right, Grapes of Wrath was
pro-New Deal propaganda with The Grapes of Wrath. And then we look at who his heroes are in the films. There are a couple exceptions, The Searchers and, of course, the hero in The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance, Tom Donovan. But if we look at the other films, the cavalry films especially.
Where the cavalry comes to the rescue at the last. What's wrong with a little military intervention to come save the day?
Well, at the heart of that, philosophically, at the philosophical heart of the book, too, is this opposition between Locke and his idea of spontaneous order and Hobbes and his idea of imposed order. Do we need the Leviathan state to provide order, or can order arise out of a community of individuals who don't need the state to provide freedom and to provide success economically? And what we find in a lot of Westerns, especially those of Ford, is, and especially in the cavalry films, is that the settlement of the frontier is perceived as this thing that is made possible by the interference of the federal government specifically through the cavalry. And on top of that, it's not just the cavalry clearing out the Indians, but in many cases, in a couple of these films, like Fort Apache and She Wore a Yellow Ribbon in Rio Grande, there are even subplots in there where the cavalry is in charge of enforcing trade embargoes on the frontier, where the bad guys in those films are small businessmen who insist on selling goods and arms to the Indians. And so the cavalry is there to prevent this capitalism from taking place. And so that really just kind of drives home that point.
This is nothing new in film. I mean, film is I took my kids to see the latest Muppet movie, which was great because I remember the Muppets from Sesame Street. And of course, the Muppets theater was under assault by an oil man, Rich Richmond or something, Tex Richmond, you know. And so I just get tired of it. It's always a business owner that's the bad guy. But when it comes to cowboys, I think a lot of Americans, and I think a lot of people throughout the world, look at a cowboy or the cowboy genre in movies, and they think, you know, this is Western justice. This is where a man can forge his own destiny. You know, he goes out there with a horse and an axe, and he finds his gold. And this is the opposite of the extra bureaucratic East with all of its social codes. This cuts through all that, and it's much more individualistic, almost in a way that libertarian-leaning people think, cowboy, that's who we are.
Well, that's certainly the reputation that Westerns have. It's just not always true that that's the message actually sent. Now, the genre is very diverse, so we can't generalize about the whole thing. But especially in that period, during the Cold War and after World War II, when, by the way, American perceptions of the government were very high. People thought very highly of their government during this period. It's not surprising then that we look at the pop culture of that time period and see that it's government agents, government experts who are providing the freedom and the success we need, and that in many cases the bad guys are greedy. And there are lots of examples. In fact, there's a hierarchy where big landowners are more evil than small landowners, and small landowners are worse than government agents. Right. Yeah, the small guy and maybe the sheriff and the government agent as well. A perfect example of this is Red River by Howard Hawks. And in the early scenes of this, he comes in, the John Wayne character comes in, and he discovers the land he's going to build his cattle farm on, his cattle ranch on. And he says, well, this is where the ranch is going to be. Well, it turns out the land was already owned by a Mexican Don who lived a few hundred miles south or whatever. So the Don's agent rides up and says, this land is already owned, and I live 300 miles to the south or whatever. Well, the sidekick then pipes up and says, oh, well, that's too much land for one man. At which point then the John Wayne character kills the agent of the Mexican Don and then just squats on the land and steals it. What's the justification for this economically? Oh, that guy had too much land for one man, so we'll just steal our portion of it for ourselves. And apparently the amount of land that John Wayne owned in the film was below the cutoff for what too much is. That's the level of sophistication of economic argument that you get in some of these Westerns.
What about some of the great spaghetti Westerns? You know, the Clint Eastwood, Fistful of Dollars, the Quick and the Dead, or what is it, the Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. I mean, that silent, quiet, I'm in it for myself, but every now and then I step out of my selfishness to help the helpless. You know, that was Clint's character in those, and those were classic movies. Is there a message in there the same way? Because if
well,
so, I didn't see
contrast, in fact, those revisionist Westerns, say Sergio Leone, Clint Eastwood, Sam Peckinpah, with those earlier guys like John Ford and Howard Hawks and Anthony Mann. And we do see a real contrast there, where in the later revisionist Westerns, usually the sheriff and the government agent is corrupt in those 70s and 80s and late 60s Westerns, which just turns the old classical Westerns on its head. And in the case of The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, which is a great anti-authoritarian, anti-war movie, yes, it's this private citizen, the man with no name, Blondie, Clint Eastwood, who travels the desert looking for buried gold. And this search for buried gold is presented as rather virtuous compared to what the other people are doing. That is mostly soldiers who are busy waging this unjust war, in this case the Civil War. And the only guy with a conscience in the war is this guy who's drunk all the time. It's the only way he can face the realities of the war and how stupid it is. Meanwhile, Tuco and Blondie search around looking for the gold. They're pretty decent fellows compared to the government and to the other people on the frontier. So it's a very different message. There's still a lot of anti-capitalism there, but it provides a little bit more sympathetic treatment of religion, even in some cases, in Leone's films, and is just more vague in terms of its anti-capitalism, I would say.
What about, the gore pictures? I'm thinking Wild Bunch. Was that Peckinpah who did Wild Bunch? Mm-hmm. That seemed to be an early gore fest kind of movie, and you had bad sheriffs in that too, didn't you?
We start to see in some of the revisionist Westerns this exploration of the theme of corporations being in league with the government. So that really
it's kind
of a
corporate welfare and cronyism.
Mm-hmm, exactly. And that's clear right from the beginning of the Wild Bunch, where the Wild Bunch, who are a sympathetic group, even though they're outlaws, are nearly gunned down by these government/railroad types who are trying to kill them. And they, of course, then have to flee to Mexico, where they end up killing tyrannical Mexican government agents in Mexico. So in these later Westerns, sometimes these freewheeling outlaws are really the agents for law and order. These private citizens provide order where the sheriff and the government actually are forced to.
Commie Cowboys. Those are the good cowboys.
Yes, right? And I would say in those later revisionist Westerns, the message is much better than it is in the Cold War Westerns.
What about the feel good comedy, the best buddy movie ever made, Butch Cassidy, Sundance Kid? They get shot by the army. or someplace else. The law is always after them. But we sympathize with the outlaws.
That falls into our post-classical period then. That's post-Ford, that's post-Anthony Mann, that's the late 60s.
Give me the top couple commie westerns where it's a guy, thanks to the government, we're okay, and fighting against a damn capitalist who owns too much.
There's a couple of examples. One is the Tin Star, which was an Anthony Mann movie, where the sheriff basically has to whip his whole town into shape. The town is basically just a giant lynch mob in waiting, and they're being constantly riled up by this small businessman who's also a racist. That's clear in the film as well. So we have the choice between the virtuous sheriff who teaches the townspeople what it means to be a good person on the one side, and then on the other side is the small businessman who's a racist and is trying to hang all of these people without the benefit of due process and so on. And really, what the message that film sends is that you need an authoritarian regime to keep the people in line, or they'll become a bunch of racist rubes who will hang your prisoners. And then another perfect case by John Ford is Two Rode Together, a 1961 movie, where you've got a bunch of wussy, craven bourgeois types, villager types, who are incapable of doing anything themselves, and they're trying to recover their kidnapped children from the Indians. Fortunately, in ride a former sheriff and a former government agent in the form of James Stewart and Richard Widmark, who come in and they return a couple people to the town. The town then degenerates into a lynch mob. The big villain in the movie is a big businessman, and they're horrible people, the townspeople, but the good paragons of virtue in the film are these government types who then teach them a lesson.
Law and order types? Let me go the other direction. That when you see the sheriff come into town, the high noon, all right, he puts on the badge and he brings in the rule of law. Now, libertarians, myself included, we believe in property rights, we believe in rule of law, and without those two things, you can't hold down anything else. So can't I just come back and say, no, come on, these guys are showing that rule of law is more important than rule of mobs?
Well, we want to look at how the government agent is contrasted with the people overall. Certainly, if we look at Locke's libertarian theories, we would see that the state really just serves as someone who's there to protect the rights of the society, which can largely govern itself, except for the few criminal elements. If we look at High Noon, however, this sends the message that everyone in town is a total yellow belly, that they abandon the sheriff, that they refuse to do anything to defend themselves, they go cower in the shadows, and in fact it's quite clear that the townspeople are more concerned about things like property rights and business rather than the more virtuous stuff that comes with law enforcement. So that turns classical liberalism on its head, which says that law and order in the state are superior to these interests of capitalism.
Just a few seconds. Best Western. If you said, here's a Western you ought to be looking at.
Oh, well, I think Unforgiven is possibly the best Western ever made, simply because it provides a very trenchant look at the role of violence on the frontier.
All right, no. Let's be honest. The only Western you need is Blazing Saddles. That's all. Everything I know about race relations comes from that. Thank you so much. Join me next week. Tell a friend, and we'll see you next time.